She walked into the most dangerous room in the city, carrying divorce papers, and the man sitting behind that desk hadn't survived 3 criminal empires by letting things go. 3 years. 3 years of silence, cold hallways, and a marriage that felt like a sentence. Elena Ashcroft had paid her father's debts with her freedom, and she was done. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that before she'd leave that office, she would overhear something that would make leaving impossible. If you're new here, subscribe now. Because this story, it's only getting started. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this reaches. The elevator doors opened onto the 42nd floor, and Elena Ashcroft stepped out into a hallway that smelled like expensive leather and old money and something darker underneath. Something she had never been able to name but had learned over 3 years to recognize. It was the smell of power that didn't ask permission, the kind of power that didn't need to. She kept her chin up. She had rehearsed this. She had stood in front of the bathroom mirror at 6 in the morning with the divorce papers folded inside her coat and practiced the exact expression she wanted on her face when she did this. Calm, resolved. Not angry. Anger would give him something to push against. Not scared. Fear would hand him everything. Just finished. A woman who had made a decision and was here to deliver it like a piece of certified mail. The receptionist, young, brunette, eyes that had clearly been trained to reveal nothing, looked up from her desk and said, "Mrs. Voss," without warmth or hostility, just that particular blankness that everyone in this building seemed to wear like a uniform. "I need to see him," Elena said. "He's in a meeting until... I need to see him now." Something in Elena's voice must have landed differently than usual, because the woman reached for her phone without another word. Elena stood there and breathed. In through the nose. Out slow. She could feel the papers against her ribs where she'd tucked them inside her coat, and the pressure of them felt like a heartbeat, steady and deliberate. She had carried those papers for 11 days before she'd been able to make herself come here. 11 days of sitting at the kitchen table in the apartment she shared with a man who barely acknowledged her existence, reading and rereading the language, making sure she understood every clause, every exit, every consequence. There were no children. There was no shared property in her name. Adrian had made certain of that 3 years ago, when their lawyers had drafted an agreement that gave her a comfortable allowance and exactly nothing else. There was, theoretically, the issue of the debt that had started all of this. Her father's debt to the Voss family, which Adrian had settled in exchange for the marriage. She had researched that too. Spoken, quietly, to a lawyer she'd found on her own. A woman in a small office on the east side who had listened to the whole story without blinking and told her that the debt for marriage arrangement existed in a legal gray area that neither party would likely want to drag into open court. That was the lever. Elena had understood that the moment the lawyer said it. Adrian Voss did not want daylight on the specifics of how their marriage had come to exist, which meant she had more standing than he probably expected. The receptionist looked up. "He'll see you." The office was exactly what it had always been. Floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over a city that had no idea what happened in this room. A desk the size of a small country, clear of everything except a single open laptop and a glass of water. Bookshelves that actually had books on them, not for decoration but arranged with the kind of deliberate order that said their owner read them and remembered what was in them. And Adrian Voss standing at the window with his back to her, hands in his pockets, looking down at the street 42 floors below like he was deciding something about it. He didn't turn around when she came in. "Close the door," he said. She did. She heard the latch click, and she walked to the center of the room and stopped, and she pulled the papers out of her coat and held them at her side, and she waited. He turned around eventually. He always did things in his own time. That was one of the first things she had understood about Adrian Voss. He operated on a schedule that belonged entirely to him, and the rest of the world was expected to adjust. He was 41 years old, and he looked it in the way that certain men look their age, meaning he looked better than he had at 30, edges that had been sharp becoming something more defined, something harder and more certain. He was not a soft man, and he had never pretended to be. He looked at the papers in her hand, and his expression didn't change at all. "What's that?" he said. Not a question. "Divorce papers," Elena said. "I had them drawn up." The silence that followed was not the silence of a man processing a surprise. It was the silence of a man deciding which version of himself to use. "Put them on the desk," he said. "I'd like you to read them. Elena." He said her name the way you'd say enough. Not loud, not cruel, just final. "Put them on the desk." She walked to the desk and set them down and stepped back. And she watched him cross the room and pick them up without sitting, without changing his posture in any way that suggested this was a thing that mattered. He read. She watched him read. His eyes moved across the pages with the same expression he probably wore reading quarterly reports. Nothing leaked. Then he set them back down. "No," he said. "Just that. One word." Elena had prepared for this too. She had known he would say no. She had known it would be said exactly this way, without apology or explanation, the way a man like Adrian Voss said no to everything, as if the word were a wall and the conversation ended where the wall began. "That's not how this works," she said, and her voice stayed level, which she was proud of. "I've spoken to a lawyer. There are grounds. I said no. Adrian." Now she was the one saying a name like a word that meant stop. "Look at me. Actually, look at me. I am 29 years old. I have lived in your apartment for 3 years. I have attended every dinner, every gala, every family obligation you required of me. I have been exactly what this arrangement asked me to be, and I want out. I'm asking you as a person, as..." She almost said as your wife, but the irony of that stopped her. "As a human being who has fulfilled every part of this agreement." Something shifted in his face. Not much. A tightening around the eyes, something moving behind them that she didn't have a name for. "The agreement doesn't have an expiration date," he said. "Every agreement can be renegotiated. Not this one." She had known, going in, that she might have to use the other thing. The thing she had spent 3 days feeling sick about before deciding she didn't have any other options. She breathed in. She breathed out. "I've met someone," she said. The room changed. She felt it rather than saw it. Some shift in the quality of the air, some alteration in the pressure. Adrian Voss stood perfectly still, and the stillness itself became something different, the way still water looks different when there's something moving beneath the surface. "Excuse me," he said. "I've met someone else." She kept her eyes on his face. "And I would like to move forward, which requires the paperwork you're holding to be signed." For a long moment, he didn't say anything. He looked at her the way he looked at the city from his window, like he was deciding something about her. Then he picked up the divorce papers off his desk and walked them to the document shredder in the corner of the room and fed them through it without breaking eye contact. The sound of the shredder was very loud in the quiet office. "Try again," he said. Elena's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs and told herself it was anger, not fear, and maybe that was even mostly true. "You can't..." "You're my wife," he said. "Until I decide otherwise, you're my wife. That's the end of this conversation." "It is absolutely not." The knock on the door was 3 short, hard raps. The knock of someone who didn't wait to be invited, because in this building there were exactly 2 kinds of people. The ones who waited and the ones who knocked like that. The door opened before either of them could respond, and Damian Reyes stepped in. Damian was Adrian's head of security, a man who had been with him for 7 years and who moved through spaces the way certain animals moved, quiet, deliberate, constantly assessing. He stopped when he saw Elena. He looked at Adrian. "It can wait," Adrian said. Damian's jaw tightened. "It can't." Something passed between the 2 men. Elena had seen it before. The language of people who'd known each other through enough that they could communicate in almost nothing. Then Adrian looked at her. "Give us a minute," he said. Elena walked toward the door. She didn't have a choice, but she didn't walk fast, and she didn't look down, and when she got to the outer office, she turned left instead of right, toward the narrow corridor that led to the private conference room, because there was a water cooler there, and she needed something to do with her hands. Or that was what she told herself. What she actually did was stop just past the doorframe, where the angle of the wall put her out of sightlines, and she stood very still, and she heard Damian's voice, low but not low enough, saying something she was never supposed to hear. "Kovac is the one. We ran it twice. Every leak for the last 4 months traces back to him. He's been feeding coordinates, personnel files, everything. And his contact is Moretti's operation. Victor Moretti has known our every move, every safe house location, every... And here Damien lowered his voice further, but Elena had already gone still in a way that was different from stillness. A way that felt like her entire body had just become an ear. Transition schedule for the shipments. 6 months of exposure, Adrian. 6 months. And then Adrian's voice, so controlled she could barely hear it. How many people know this? Me, you, and whoever Kovac is reporting to. Keep it that way. There's a timeline issue. Kovac moves through 3 security checkpoints with full clearance. If he senses we're onto him, he won't. You don't know that. I know Kovac. A pause. I thought I knew Kovac, which means I know exactly how he thinks he's invisible. That's the advantage. Elena pressed herself flatter against the wall. Her heart was doing something she didn't have words for. Not racing, hammering, flat and hard and deliberate, like someone was building something inside her chest and the work was urgent. Kovac, she knew that name. She had met him at a company dinner 14 months ago. Dark-haired man in his late 40s, the kind of person who made you feel noticed without being sure you wanted to be. He had been solicitous to her, in the way that people are solicitous to wives they know have no actual power. Pleasant, slightly too warm, not quite respectful. She had filed it away the way she filed most things in this life she'd been handed, as information she might need and probably wouldn't. Now she needed it. She made herself walk to the water cooler. She poured a paper cup of water and she drank it standing up, and she made herself think, really think. Not about what she'd overheard in terms of what it meant for the men in that room, but in terms of what it meant for her. She had walked in here with one bargaining chip, her lawyer's assessment of the gray area debt agreement. And it hadn't been enough. Adrian Voss had put her divorce papers through a shredder without blinking. He had looked her in the eye while he did it. The message was unmistakable. She had nothing he needed to care about. But now she had something else. She wasn't sure yet what shape it would take. She was still standing in a hallway with a paper cup of water in her hand, 3 years of invisible marriage in her rear view, and a name she'd just overheard through a doorway that she was certain could either save her or destroy her, depending entirely on what she chose to do next. The door to the office opened and Damien came out, and he looked at her, Mom, really looked at her, the way he sometimes did, with those eyes that were always calculating something. And she looked back at him with the expression she'd practiced in the mirror, the calm, resolved one, and she held it steady. He walked past her without a word. Elena poured herself another cup of water. Her hands had stopped shaking. When she walked back into the office, Adrian was at the window again. Same position, same posture. The city 42 floors below, unchanged. The answer is still no, he said, without turning around. I know, Elena said. He turned, looked at her. Something moved in his expression. Confusion, maybe, that she wasn't still fighting, or something more careful than confusion. That's all you've got to say. For now, she said. She picked up her coat from the chair where she'd draped it. She buttoned it slowly, one button at a time, watching him watch her. She let herself look back at him the way you look at something you are doing the math on, not with emotion, with calculation. I'll see you at home, she said. She walked out and pressed the button for the elevator and stood there with her shoulders straight and the divorce papers gone and something new sitting in the hollow of her chest where the fear had been. Not hope exactly. Not yet. But the very first edge of a plan, just beginning to take shape. The elevator arrived. She stepped inside. The doors closed behind her. She had 11 days of careful planning behind her and nothing to show for it except a shredded document and a name she wasn't supposed to know. But Adrian Voss had made one miscalculation, the same one everyone in this world always made about the women they kept in rooms with no view. He had left her alone in a hallway, and Elena Ashcroft had never in her life wasted a minute of silence. The elevator descended. She counted floors and thought about Kovac, the timing of what Damien had said, the way Adrian's voice had changed when he heard it, the particular weight of the phrase 6 months of exposure. She thought about what someone with that information might be worth to the right person. And then she thought about what someone with knowledge of that information might be worth, not to a rival, not to an enemy, but to the man who needed to stop it, to a husband who had just made very clear she had nothing he wanted. Until now. The lobby opened up around her, marble and steel, and the sound of the city bleeding in from the revolving doors. She walked through without stopping, out into the cold air, and she kept walking, and behind her the Voss Tower rose 42 floors into a sky the color of old iron. She had a phone call to make. Not to her lawyer, not to the man she'd invented, the one she'd used to try to provoke a jealousy she wasn't even sure Adrian Voss was capable of feeling. She needed to think. She needed 24 hours and a very quiet room and every memory she had of every name, every face, every overheard fragment from 3 years of being the woman nobody at those dinners ever bothered to talk to. Because that invisibility, that thing that had made her feel like she was disappearing, had actually made her into something Adrian Voss had never considered. A witness. A collector of details. A woman who had spent 3 years memorizing a world she'd been told wasn't hers. She turned a corner and the wind hit her full in the face, and she didn't flinch. She had one shot at this. One offer to make, one deal to propose, one chance to turn a name she'd overheard through a doorframe into the key to the only prison she'd ever been locked in. She had to get it exactly right. And tomorrow morning she was going to walk back into that building. Not with divorce papers, not with invented lovers, not with anything a lawyer had written for her, but with something Adrian Voss would actually listen to. A proposition, a trade. Help me, and I'll save your empire. Sign my papers, and I'll give you Kovacs. She just had to make sure he didn't find out how terrified she was before she got the words out. Will Elena's desperate gamble work? Or will Adrian Voss see straight through her? And what happens when the man you're trying to leave is the only one who can keep you alive? Part 2 drops next. Make sure you're subscribed, because this story is about to get a great deal more dangerous. She didn't sleep. That wasn't unusual. Elena had spent most of the last 3 years lying awake in a bed that felt like a waiting room, staring at a ceiling that had nothing to tell her. But this was different. This wasn't the hollow, drifting insomnia of a woman running out of reasons to get up in the morning. This was the wired electric sleeplessness of someone whose brain had locked onto a problem and refused to release it until every angle had been examined, discarded, or filed. She sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen, and she wrote down everything she remembered. Not in bullet points. In sentences, because sentences forced her to think about sequence, about cause and effect, about the way things connected. She wrote down Kovacs' name and everything she could pull from memory about the 14 months since she'd met him. The dinner where they'd been introduced, the way he'd smiled at her, the 3 or 4 subsequent events where he'd been present. She wrote down what she remembered of the conversations he'd had with other people in those rooms. Not the words, because she hadn't been paying the right kind of attention then, but the textures. Who he gravitated toward. Who seemed uncomfortable when he arrived. The way he'd stood next to Adrian at the Harrington Foundation Gala last spring and said something that had made Adrian's jaw tighten before he'd smoothed it over with a laugh. She wrote that down. By 4 in the morning, she had 3 pages. By 5:30, she had 5, and the kitchen was cold because she hadn't thought to turn the heat up, and there was a cup of coffee at her elbow that had gone completely cold without her noticing. She read back through everything she'd written. She crossed out the things that were feeling, not fact. What remained was leaner than she'd hoped and more substantial than she'd feared. It wasn't enough to hand to Adrian as a completed picture. She wasn't in a position to give him answers, not yet. But it was enough to make the case that she was worth listening to. That she had been in the right rooms at the right times and had cataloged things his own people had missed. Because his own people were always looking for what they expected to see, and Elena had spent 3 years being so thoroughly underestimated that she'd become effectively invisible, which turned out to be its own kind of weapon. She showered, she dressed carefully, not the way she dressed for his events, not the armor of an expensive gown and jewelry chosen for maximum impressiveness. She wore what she actually wore when she felt most like herself. Dark trousers, a slate gray blouse, flat shoes. She pulled her hair back because she wanted her face visible. She did not want there to be anything to hide behind. She was back in the elevator of Voss Tower at 8:47 in the morning, the same receptionist, the same blankness. "He's not in until 9:30, the woman said. "I'll wait," Elena said, and sat down on the modernist sofa against the wall that was clearly not intended to actually be sat on for long stretches. And she waited. She kept the legal pad on her knees, face down. She didn't review her notes again. She had them. They were in her now. Going over them again would only be a way of managing anxiety, and she didn't have the luxury of managing anxiety right now. She needed it raw. She needed to feel the edges of exactly how much was at stake. Adrian arrived at 9:22. He came off the elevator without looking at his phone, which was unusual for most powerful men she'd observed, but completely characteristic of him. He had other people to look at phones, and he preferred to keep his eyes on rooms. He saw her the moment he stepped into the reception area, and he stopped walking for just a fraction of a second, which on anyone else might not have been noticeable. But Elena had spent 3 years studying the micro-adjustments of a man who refused to show anything, and she caught it. "You're early," he said. "You're late," she said. Something moved in his eyes. Not amusement. Something more cautious than that. He tilted his head slightly toward his office, and she stood and followed him in, and this time she closed the door herself without being asked. She put the legal pad on his desk before he'd even reached his chair. He looked at it. He looked at her. He didn't pick it up. "Sit down," he said. "I'd rather stand." "Elena." "I'd rather stand, Adrian." He sat. He picked up the legal pad and he read it, and she watched him the way she'd watched him read the divorce papers yesterday, except that this time his expression didn't stay neutral. It shifted. Small movements, the kind that would be invisible to anyone who hadn't memorized his face, but she had, and she tracked everyone. His brow pulled together on the 3rd page. On the 4th, his jaw moved. On the 5th, he set the pad down slowly, with the kind of deliberateness that meant he was choosing his movements very carefully. "Where did you get this?" he said. "I compiled it. From 3 years of being in rooms you brought me to." "That's not what I asked." "It's the answer." She kept her voice even. "I didn't intercept anything. I didn't hack anything. I didn't contact anyone I wasn't supposed to. Every single thing on those pages came from my own memory of events I attended as your wife, which you required me to attend, which you apparently never considered might result in me paying attention." He looked at her for a long time. The office was very quiet. Outside the windows, the city was already fully in motion. She could see a helicopter crossing the skyline, 2 construction cranes visible against a pale blue sky, all of it completely indifferent to the conversation happening in this room. "You overheard Damien yesterday," he said. It wasn't a question. She didn't treat it like one. "I heard a name," she said, "and I spent last night connecting that name to everything I'd already seen. What's on those pages is mine. I built it. You can verify any of it. I'm going to need you to I'm not finished." She hadn't planned to interrupt him. It came out of something older and more tired than strategy. "I want you to look at those pages and tell me honestly whether your people have half of that. Tell me whether Damien's team has those connections mapped. Tell me whether anyone who works for you has spent 3 years sitting at tables next to these men and listening to what they say when they think the wife is just part of the furniture." The silence stretched. She could hear her own heartbeat. "Why are you bringing me this?" Adrian said. "Because I want something in return." "The papers." "The papers?" "Signed, dated, filed. Once the situation with Kovac is resolved, once you have confirmed that your organization is clean, you sign. You don't delay. You don't negotiate new terms. You don't find another reason. You sign. I walk out. We're done." He leaned back in his chair and he looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, and she couldn't entirely read it, which made the back of her neck feel cold. Adrian Voss was a man she had learned to read. The fact that he was showing her something she didn't have a category for was either very good or very bad. "You're serious," he said. "I have never been more serious about anything. You understand what you're asking to be involved in?" "I understand exactly what I'm asking to be involved in. I've been adjacent to it for 3 years. I'm not naive about what your organization is or what it does. I'm also not asking to become part of it. I'm offering you a specific skill for a specific period of time in exchange for a specific outcome. It's a contract. You understand contracts." Something crossed his face at that. The faintest thing, barely a flicker. And then it was gone. He picked up the legal pad again and looked at one of the pages. She watched his eyes move. He was checking something, testing a connection she'd made against something he already knew. His jaw tightened. She'd been right about something on that page. She could tell by the way his hand shifted on the paper. There are things you don't know, he said, about the scope of this. Then tell me. He looked up. You want me to brief you. I want to be useful, which requires me to know what I'm working with. The look on his face was extraordinary, really. She would think about it later, replaying it. The specific expression of a man who prided himself on seeing every angle, discovering that he'd missed one that had been sitting across the dinner table from him for 1,000 evenings. It wasn't quite respect. It was something harder than that. Something that looked more like the moment a chess player realizes their opponent has been playing a different game entirely. Sit down, he said again. This time she did. He talked for 40 minutes. He didn't soften it, and he didn't summarize. He gave her the actual shape of the problem, the names, the timeline, the full extent of what Kovac had been feeding to Victor Moretti's network, and how long it had been going on. She listened without interrupting. She took no notes, because she didn't need to, and also because she didn't want him to see her writing things down. She wanted him to keep having the experience of watching her absorb information without apparent effort, because that experience would keep recalibrating his assessment of her. Every time he underestimated what she retained, he revised upward. She needed him revising upward. When he finished, she sat with it for a moment and then said, Kovac isn't working alone inside your organization. Adrian's eyes sharpened. What makes you say that? Because of the Harrington Gala. Last April, Kovac spoke to your logistics director. I can't remember his name. Heavier man. Always has a pen in his breast pocket. Stellan. They spoke for about 11 minutes in the East Corridor. I was standing near the bar. Neither of them saw me. The body language was wrong for a social conversation. Kovac was delivering something. Stellan was receiving it. And Stellan looked. Not nervous. Committed. There's a difference. Nervous people look like they want to leave. Committed people look like they've already decided something and they're just waiting for the moment. The quality of Adrian's silence had changed. She could feel it. Stellan has been with me for 9 years, he said. I know. You're telling me? I'm telling you what I saw. You can verify it or dismiss it. That's your call. She held his gaze. But if I were you, I'd verify it first. He stood up, walked to the window. She watched his back, the tension in it, the way his shoulders had shifted from their usual controlled set into something tighter, something that was managing more than usual. This changes the timeline, he said, mostly to himself. I know. He turned. How do you know? Because if Kovac suspects you're closing in, Stellan is his exit route. He'll move the remaining intelligence through Stellan's channels and disappear before you can seal it. If you've been building a case around Kovac alone, it has a gap that's large enough to lose everything through. The look he gave her then was the one she would remember longest. Not because it was warm, it wasn't, not exactly, but because it was entirely without condescension, and from Adrian Voss that was its own kind of revelation. What do you need? He said. Access. To the events we were already scheduled to attend together. The Caldwell dinner next Thursday. The Rice Foundation benefit. Your cousin Marcus's engagement party. I need to be there as your wife. Present, visible, believable, and I need enough context to know what I'm looking for in each room. And if someone approaches you, asks you something they shouldn't, then I handle it. Elena. His voice had shifted. Something in it she wasn't prepared for. Lower, more human. If Kovac realizes what's happening, he won't. Because why would he? Why would anyone in your world take seriously the possibility that your kept wife has been paying attention? She said it without bitterness, which cost her something, but she kept it flat. That's the entire advantage, Adrian. That's why this works. Because every single person in your organization looked at me for 3 years and saw furniture. I need that to keep being true for a little while longer. He was quiet for a long moment. He looked out the window again, and then back at her. And when he spoke, his voice was careful in a different way. Not guarded against her, but careful for reasons that didn't entirely include her. And she understood that this was the closest he was going to come, right now, to showing her the actual weight of what he was carrying. If you're inside this and something goes wrong, he said, I can't guarantee. I'm not asking you to guarantee anything. I'm asking you to hold up your end of the deal when it's over. He looked at her for a long time. Then he held out his hand. She looked at it. She took it. His grip was firm and dry and brief, and when he released her hand, there was a moment where neither of them moved, and the office was very quiet, and she was suddenly, acutely aware that she had just made an agreement with a man she didn't entirely understand to do something she'd never done before, for a reason that had seemed clear at 8:47 in the morning and now felt slightly more complicated. She picked up her coat. "The Caldwell dinner is black tie," he said. "I know, I've been to it." "I'll have Damien." "Don't tell Damien." She said it without hesitation. "Not yet. Not until you've checked what I said about Stellan. If I'm right about Stellan, then you have a trust problem that goes beyond Kovacs, and until you know exactly how far it goes, you should minimize who knows I'm involved." He looked at her. Something moved through his expression that she couldn't quite name. "You've thought about this." "I thought about it all night." Most people would have taken what they overheard and used it to get out, cut a deal with someone else, used it as leverage in a different direction. "I'm not most people," she said, "and I don't want leverage. I want my life back. The fastest way to do that is to give you something worth trading for." She walked to the door. She had her hand on the handle when he spoke again. "Elena." She stopped but didn't turn. "Why didn't you just leave?" His voice was quiet. Not soft. Quiet. There was a distinction. 3 years ago. Why didn't you find another way? She stood there with her hand on the door handle, and she thought about all the ways she could answer that. She thought about her father and the particular shape of his desperation. She thought about being 26 and feeling like the walls of every possible future were closing in simultaneously. She thought about the contract she'd signed in a lawyer's office with 2 witnesses present, and the way her hand had been completely steady even though her entire body had felt like it was vibrating. "Because there wasn't another way," she said. "At the time." She opened the door. "There is now," she said, and walked out. The next 8 days had a texture she hadn't expected. She had anticipated cold professionalism, brief exchanges of necessary information, coordinated appearances, the mechanical execution of a plan. What she got was more complicated. Adrian called her the following morning, on the phone, not through his assistant, which was unusual enough to make her chest do something she immediately told it to stop doing, and told her that she'd been right about Stellan. 3 independent lines of verification, all pointing to the same conclusion. Stellan had been active for at least 2 months longer than Kovacs. The exposure was worse than they'd known. She had been right. She sat with the phone pressed to her ear, and she listened to Adrian's voice deliver this information with the controlled flatness of someone who'd discovered that a man he'd trusted for 9 years had been selling him out, and underneath the control she could hear something she recognized from her own life. The specific exhaustion of finding out that your judgment about a person was entirely wrong. The thing that was worse than betrayal because it included self-recrimination, the question of how you hadn't seen it, whether some part of you had, and you'd looked away. "I'll need you to identify anyone else Stellan might have connected with at those events," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm already working on it." A pause. "You're already working on it." "I've been working on it since we talked yesterday. I'm sorry. Did you think I'd wait to be asked?" The sound he made was not quite a laugh. It was too short and too reluctant for that. It was the sound of someone surprised into something they hadn't planned on feeling. She filed it away with the rest of the things she was collecting. The Caldwell dinner was 12 days after their agreement. She wore midnight blue, not because he'd suggested it, but because she'd learned over 3 years that midnight blue at the Caldwell events created a specific visual impression, elegant enough to belong, understated enough to be overlooked. She needed to be overlooked. She needed to be the wife at her husband's side who smiled at the right moments and said gracious things, and then disappeared into the peripheral vision of every ambitious, paranoid, self-important man in that room. She was good at that. What she hadn't planned for was Adrian. She had planned for a husband-shaped obstacle to stand next to. She'd expected the distance. 3 years had made it a kind of geography. The specific gap between them at events, the professional courtesy of his hand at the small of her back when they entered rooms, the way he looked at her across tables with the polished blankness of a man discharging an obligation. Instead, he was different. He stayed close, Not theatrically close, not performing tenderness for an audience, but present in a way that kept catching her off guard, leaning down to say something in her ear about one of the guests, asking her quietly what she was picking up from the table near the window, listening when she told him with the focused attention of someone who actually intended to use what they heard. It was the most he had spoken to her in 3 years. She told herself it was operational. She kept her own expression neutral and her observations precise, and she didn't let herself feel the warmth of being listened to by this specific person, because that way was a direction she couldn't afford. They danced. It was expected at the Caldwell dinner. There was always an orchestra in the second hall, and couples circulated, and not dancing would have been more conspicuous than dancing. His hand was at her waist, and her hand was on his shoulder, and they were close in the way that dancing requires, and she kept her eyes moving over the room while they moved. 2:00, she said quietly. The man in the gray suit talking to Harrington's wife. I've seen him at 2 of Victor Moretti's events. He's not on your radar yet. Adrian didn't look. He kept his eyes on her face, which was the right operational choice. Looking would have flagged them. But the effect of it was strange because it meant for the length of that sentence he was looking at her the way she'd never actually seen him look at her before. Directly. Like she was the thing in the room worth tracking. Name, he said. I don't have one, but he uses his left hand to hold his drink and his right to shake hands, and he's been touching his watch every 4 minutes since we entered the room, which means he's timing something or waiting for a signal. How long have you been tracking him? Since we sat down to dinner. She felt his hand shift slightly at her waist. Not pulling her closer, just adjusting. Like the information had changed something small and physical about how he was standing. You're not what I thought you were, he said. She looked at him then, full on, which the dance allowed for. No, she said, I'm not. They finished the dance and separated with the ordinary grace of 2 people who had done this many times, and she went to the bar and he circulated toward the gray-suited man, and she stood with a glass of water she wasn't drinking, and she thought, very firmly, about the papers. The signed divorce papers. The life on the other side of this. The apartment she was going to get. The work she was going to return to. The mornings that would belong entirely to herself. She thought about all of that very deliberately, like a person taking inventory of something they were protecting. And then she stopped thinking about it, because across the room Kovac had just arrived, 40 minutes late, and the first thing he did when he entered was look directly at her. Not at Adrian, not at the room, at her. And the look lasted exactly 1 second too long. Her glass of water was very cold in her hand. She smiled at him, just the corner of her mouth, the social acknowledgement of a familiar face, and turned slightly away. And her heart was doing that hammering thing again, the flat, urgent beat from the hallway outside Adrian's office. And she understood with sudden absolute clarity that the timeline had just changed. Kovac suspected something. Maybe not her specifically. Maybe not yet. But something in the room had shifted for him. Something had triggered the instinct of a man who'd survived this long by trusting his instincts. And he was now scanning the room with different eyes, and she had approximately 40 seconds before he landed on the thing that had felt wrong and identified it. She set down her water glass and crossed the room at the pace of a woman looking for the powder room, and she reached Adrian before he reached Kovac, and she put her hand on his arm and leaned up and said very quietly into the space beside his ear, He knows, or he suspects. We have maybe a minute before he makes us. Tell me what you need me to do right now. And Adrian Voss, who had spent his entire adult life being the most controlled person in every room he entered, looked at her with something in his face that was entirely uncontrolled, just for a moment. Something that might have been alarm, or might have been the abrupt arrival of a feeling he hadn't made space for, she couldn't be certain. And then the control came back, and he said very quietly, Stay next to me. Don't leave my side. And whatever I say to him, agree with it. She nodded. She didn't move away. He didn't move away either. And Kovac was crossing the room toward them with a smile on his face that didn't reach his eyes, and the orchestra was playing something in 3/4 time, and Elena Ashcroft stood next to the man she was trying to leave and felt, with complete certainty, that the next 60 seconds were going to determine whether her plan survived the night. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, standing there with her shoulder barely an inch from Adrian's arm, was that Kovac wasn't walking toward them because he suspected Elena. He was walking toward them because 40 minutes ago, someone inside Adrian's organization had sent him a message. And the message had said, "She's been talking." Kovac smiled the way men smile when they already know the answer to the question they're about to ask. It was a specific kind of smile. Not warm, not predatory exactly, but assured in a way that made Elena's stomach drop before her brain had fully processed why. He was 50 feet away and closing, moving through the crowd with the unhurried confidence of someone who understood that rushing telegraphed intention and every step he took was measured, sociable. The picture of a man arriving late to a party and making his way toward familiar faces. His eyes, though. His eyes were doing something entirely different. Elena felt Adrian's arm stiffen slightly beneath her hand. He'd clocked it, too. "Kovac," Adrian said when the man was close enough. His voice was exactly right. Warm, neutral, the sound of a host acknowledging a guest. Nothing in it to indicate that 48 hours ago his security chief had laid out evidence of a 6-month betrayal, and this man's name had been at the center of every page. "Adrian." Kovac clasped his hand and they shook with the practiced ease of men who had done this many times and knew exactly what the gesture was worth. Then Kovac turned to Elena, and his eyes moved over her face with an attention that was careful to look like politeness. "Elena, you look wonderful. I was just saying to Charlotte last week that we never see you two at these things anymore." "We were in Vienna in March," Elena said, because it was true, and because it was the kind of specific, casual correction that a wife makes without thinking, the kind that landed like normalcy. "I'm sure we crossed paths with someone who mentioned it." "That's right, I heard." He accepted a glass from a passing server without looking at it. "How was it?" "Cold," she said. "Beautiful." Adrian worked the entire time. She glanced at Adrian with the particular fond exasperation of a wife who has said this sentence many times, and Adrian did something she hadn't expected. He looked back at her with something in his eyes that was almost apologetic, almost rueful, an expression so precisely like a real husband's response that it stopped her breath for just a second before she found it again. Kovac watched them. His smile stayed exactly where it was. "Listen, I actually wanted to catch you tonight," he said to Adrian, shifting the register of his voice by just enough, dropping the social ease by a fraction, adding the weight of business beneath it. "There's a situation with the Kellerman account I'd like your read on. Nothing urgent, but if we could find 10 minutes before the end of the evening—" "Of course," Adrian said. "Find me after dessert." Kovac nodded. He looked at Elena one more time. Just a look. Nothing you could point to, nothing that would sound like anything if you described it to someone else later. Just a look. "Always a pleasure," he said, and moved on. Elena waited until he was 8 feet away. Then she tilted her head toward Adrian's shoulder as if she were saying something private and wifely, and said through a smile she kept fixed and pleasant, "He knows we're watching him. He came over to measure how much." "I know," Adrian said, his own smile unchanged, his eyes following someone across the room who had nothing to do with anything. "The question is, who told him?" "The message you mentioned. Someone in your organization." "Yes." "How many people knew I was involved?" A pause, very brief. 3. She absorbed that. 3 people who knew she was working with Adrian, one of whom was apparently feeding information to the other side. She kept her expression arranged into the pleasant blankness of a woman at a charity dinner, and she felt the floor shift slightly under everything she'd built in the last 8 days. "I need you to get me out of this room," she said quietly. "Not now. In 12 minutes. Make it look like your idea." He didn't ask why. That was the first thing that surprised her. He just gave the smallest nod, barely a movement at all, and 14 minutes later he had his hand at her back and was steering them toward the coat room with the apologetic smile of a man whose wife has a headache, and they were in the elevator before she let herself breathe properly. In the car, she said, "Take me home." My home or mine? She meant the apartment, his apartment that she'd been living in like a lodger for 3 years. "I need to think," he told the driver, and they rode in silence. And the silence was different from the silence they'd shared for 3 years. Not empty, not avoidant, but full of something that neither of them was ready to name yet, something that was taking up more space in the car than either of their bodies. When they got upstairs, she went directly to the kitchen and she stood at the counter with both hands flat on the cold marble, and she thought about the three people who'd known she was involved. 3. She didn't know who they were. Adrian hadn't told her, which she'd thought was operational caution, and now understood was also the habit of a man who trusted no one completely, not even someone he'd just made an agreement with. She didn't know their names. She didn't know which one had talked. She heard Adrian come into the kitchen behind her. "Tell me the 3 names," she said. "Elena, Adrian." She turned around. She looked at him with everything she had. All the tiredness, all the calculation, the whole weight of 8 days of doing this carefully, and now standing in her kitchen at 11 at night watching it start to fray. "Tell me the 3 names." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Damien, my cousin Marcus, and Raina." She knew Damien. She'd seen Marcus twice since the agreement. He'd been present at one of their operational conversations because the engagement party was one of their planned events, and Adrian had briefed him on what to expect. Raina she knew less well, Adrian's personal attorney, sharp-faced woman in her 50s who had always looked at Elena with a particular professional neutrality that could have meant anything. "Raina," Elena said. Something moved in Adrian's face. "No." "Raina," she said again, not an accusation, a calculation she was doing out loud. "She has the most to lose from the divorce going through. She's the one who drafted the original marriage agreement. If I leave, the question of how that agreement was structured becomes uncomfortable for everyone involved in it, including her. Raina has been my attorney for 11 years. And Stellan worked for you for 9, and Kovac for 7. She held his gaze. At what point does the number of years stop being a reason to trust someone and start being a reason to wonder why they've stayed this close this long? The look on his face was difficult to watch. Not because it crumbled, it didn't, he wouldn't let it, but because she could see the cost of keeping it together. The specific effort of a man who had built an entire life on his ability to read people, discovering that the room he was standing in might be full of people he'd misread. "I'll look into it," he said. "Look into it tonight," she said. "Because Kovac is going to move. Whatever he came to that dinner to assess, he assessed it. He knows we're closing. He's going to do something to protect himself. And if your attorney is his exit route, he'll use it before morning." Adrian pulled out his phone. He was on it for 3 hours. She could hear him from the living room where she'd made herself sit with a glass of water and one of the books from the shelf she'd never actually read, holding it open to a page she wasn't seeing. She could hear the low, controlled urgency of his voice through the walls, the pauses, the clipped exchanges that sounded like orders being given and confirmations being received. She did not sleep. At 2:17 in the morning, Adrian came out of the study. He stood in the doorway of the living room, and he looked at her, and his face told her everything before he said a word. There was something in it she had never seen there before. Not emotion exactly, but the aftermath of emotion. The look of a man who has just absorbed something that hit him and is in the process of deciding how to carry it forward. "It was Raina," he said. The words landed flat and heavy. Elena set down the book. "She'd been working with Moretti for 2 years," he said. "Not just feeding information about the current situation. Everything. The Kellerman account restructuring, the Harrington Foundation connections, the Vienna meeting." He stopped. His jaw moved. "The marriage contract." Elena went very still. "What about it?" she said. "The specific terms, the debt arrangement, the way it was structured to make it legally binding in ways that weren't obvious." He looked at her directly. "Moretti knew those terms. He's been using them as a template. 2 other women in the last 18 months. Same structure, different families." She didn't say anything for a moment. She sat with it. The information arranged itself in her mind in a way that was methodical, and she made herself be methodical about it, because the alternative was something she wasn't prepared to have in this room right now. She handed him a blueprint, Elena said. "Yes." "For trapping women." "Yes." The silence that followed was not the same kind as any silence that had come before it. It was something harder, something that had edges. "Where is Raina now?" Elena said. "We're looking for her. She's not at her apartment. Her phone is off. She left the city within the last 4 hours. We have a confirmed sighting at a private airfield." His voice was flat in a way that meant he was keeping something very large, very compressed. "Kovac is also gone. Damien just confirmed he wasn't at his apartment when the team arrived. Elena stood up. She did it slowly because her legs felt strange. Not weak, just disconnected, like the information had rerouted something in her body and the signals were still catching up. They ran, she said. Yes. Which means they knew you were going to move tonight. Yes. Which means someone told them. She looked at him. After you made the calls tonight, after you started pulling on Raina's thread, someone in the team you assembled in the last 3 hours told them you were coming. Adrian pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of his nose, and she watched the gesture, which was the closest thing to a visible crack she'd ever seen from him. It lasted less than 2 seconds. Then his hand dropped. I know, he said. She sat back down. She put her hands on her knees and she looked at the floor and she thought, the problem with the plan, with any plan that relied on the organization to execute itself, was that the organization was compromised in ways that were still unknown. She had given Adrian Stellan. She had given him Raina. Kovac they'd already known about. But Damien's confirmation tonight that someone in the newly assembled team had leaked to Kovac within hours meant the infection went deeper still, went places they hadn't mapped. And without the ability to trust the organization's own infrastructure, every move they made would be visible to the other side before they made it. She looked up. How many people can you trust completely? Not professionally, not historically, completely. He thought about it, which already told her something. A man with real answers doesn't pause. 3, he said. Maybe 4. That's what you have to work with. She stood again, stayed standing this time. Whatever you were planning to do with the full apparatus, you can't. The apparatus is the problem. You need to run this smaller, faster. And you need to find Kovac and Raina before they reach Moretti. Because once they're under his protection, everything they know becomes his operational intelligence, and you lose the advantage entirely. I know all of this, he said. And for the first time she heard something in his voice that sounded like the strain of a man who knew exactly what he was facing and was measuring himself against it. Then here's what you don't know yet, she said. Kovac looked at me tonight, specifically at me. He wasn't looking at you, he wasn't surveying the room. He came to that dinner and the first person he looked at was me. Which means the message that was sent to him, the one that said, she's been talking, included enough detail that he knows I'm the variable. He knows I brought you something, which means I'm not invisible anymore. The room got very quiet. And if I'm not invisible anymore, she said, then I'm a liability to the people who want this to fail. And liabilities in your world don't, he said. Adrian, I heard you. He said it with a sharpness that surprised her, and then immediately after the sharpness, there was something else, something that ran underneath it like a current. He moved, not toward the window, not to his phone, but across the room, and he stopped about 4 feet from her, which was closer than they'd stood to each other outside of choreographed social performance in as long as she could remember. I heard you. I understand what you're saying. I'm telling you, don't finish that sentence. Not tonight. She looked at him. 4 feet between them, and the living room was very quiet, and outside the windows, the city was doing what the city always did, indifferent and continuous, and she could see something in his face that she didn't have a file for, something that was operating below the level of strategy. We need to move locations, she said, practically, because that was what was needed. If Raina knew enough to give them the terms of the marriage contract, she knew this address. And if Kovac is now operating under Moretti's protection and he decides I'm the variable that needs to be removed, we're leaving tonight, he said. Where? There's a property in the mountains, 3 hours north, small staff, people I'd stake my life on. A pause. People I have staked my life on. Okay, she said. Pack what you need for 2 weeks. She almost said something about the divorce papers, about the agreement, about the timeline. And then she looked at his face, and she understood that they were somewhere different now, in a situation that had moved past the transactional boundaries of their deal into something rawer and more dangerous, and the papers could wait. The papers could wait because the papers didn't matter if she was dead. She went to the bedroom. She packed efficiently, without sentiment, the way a person packs when they don't know what they're packing for. She took the legal pad. She took the notes she'd spent 8 days building. She took the small recorder she'd been using to log observations after events, because in it were 40 minutes of detail from the Caldwell dinner, including the gray-suited man's timing and position that she hadn't fully transcribed yet. She stood in the closet for a moment with her bag in her hand and she breathed. She had walked into Adrian Voss's office with divorce papers 9 days ago. She had been invisible and underestimated, and so thoroughly ignored that she'd been able to build a detailed intelligence map of his organization from 3 years of being in the right rooms. She had made a deal. She had been useful. She had been right about things. She had stood next to him at a charity dinner and felt for the first time in 3 years like a person who was actually present in her own life. And now Reno was gone, and Kovac was gone. And there was a message somewhere in the ruins of tonight that had her name in it, and the mountain property was 3 hours north, and the plan she'd built was compromised in ways she couldn't fully see yet, and she was standing in a closet packing for an unknown number of days with a man she was trying to leave. She shouldered the bag and walked out. Adrian was in the hallway with his own bag, already packed, which meant he'd been prepared to leave at short notice regardless of tonight, which meant he was operating with a layer of contingency she hadn't known about, which meant there were still things about his position she didn't fully understand. She filed that away. They rode the elevator down in silence. His car was already at the building entrance. Not the usual town car, something lower and darker and without a driver, because he was driving himself. That told her more than almost anything else about where they were. She got in. He got in. The city moved around them as he pulled into traffic. She watched the lights through the window. The specific way the city looked at nearly 3 in the morning, the illuminated emptiness of it, the feeling that the version of the world visible at this hour was a different city than the one people lived in during the day. Colder. More honest about itself. She had been right about Reyna. She had been right about Stellan. She had correctly read Kovac's body language at the dinner and given Adrian enough warning to start the night's chain of events. None of it had been enough. "The 3 people you trust completely," she said, after they'd been on the highway for 20 minutes. "Who are they?" "2 people on my security detail, a man named Garrett, who's been with me since before any of this, and my brother." "I didn't know you had a brother." "No one does," he said. "That's the point." She absorbed that. A hidden brother. A man with a secret family member in a world where family members were leverage. She thought about the effort it must have taken to keep that hidden, the discipline required, the specific loneliness of protecting something by making it invisible. She understood that suddenly, in a way she hadn't expected to. "What about me?" she said. He glanced at her. Just a glance, back to the road immediately. "What about you?" "Do you trust me?" The road stretched ahead of them, dark except for the headlights. He drove the way he did everything, without wasted movement, exactly calibrated to the conditions. "You've been right about everything," he said. "That's not what I asked." A pause, the kind that meant thinking, not deflecting. "I don't know," he said. "But I'm here, and you're here, and that's the most honest answer I can give you right now." She nodded. She turned back to the window. 40 minutes later, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She looked at it, and then she looked at Adrian, and she said, "Someone's contacting me. Unknown. Don't answer." She answered. The voice on the other end was Kovac's. Low, unrushed, with the particular steadiness of a man who believed he was in a strong position. "Elena," he said, "I need you to listen carefully, because I'm only going to say this once. Whatever Adrian has told you about the deal you've made, whatever he's promised you at the end of this, I want you to consider whether a man who kept you invisible for 3 years is actually the kind of man who follows through on promises." A pause. "I have information that changes everything you think you know about why your marriage happened, about your father's debt, about who actually structured that agreement, and why. And if you want to know the truth before it disappears with me, you have approximately 12 hours. The line went dead. Elena lowered the phone. Her heart was doing the hammering thing again, but this time it was different. This time it was the hammer of something that was cracking, the sound of a structure she'd been building taking damage in a place she hadn't reinforced because she hadn't known it was load-bearing. Your father's debt. About who actually structured that agreement and why. She kept her eyes forward. She kept her face completely still. She did not look at Adrian, but she felt him, felt the particular quality of his silence in the 3 seconds after she'd lowered the phone. And in that silence, she heard something she hadn't heard before, or hadn't let herself hear. The silence of a man who already knows what was just said on the other end of that call, and is waiting to find out whether she knows it too. She didn't say anything for 4 miles. Adrian drove, and the highway unspooled ahead of them in the dark, and Elena sat with the dead phone in her hand and the specific weight of Kovach's voice still occupying the space behind her ears. She was aware of her own breathing, the way it had gone shallow without her deciding to let it, the way her body was managing something her mind hadn't finished processing yet. Your father's debt. About who actually structured that agreement and why. She had spent 3 years not asking certain questions. She had understood, in the way that people understand things they're not ready to examine, that the full architecture of her marriage contained rooms she hadn't opened. Her father's debt to the Voss family had existed before Adrian. That much she'd always known. Her father had told her the number, and she had understood the number to be insurmountable, and she had understood that when Adrian Voss had offered to settle it in exchange for the marriage, there had been no other door. She had accepted this the way you accept certain weather. It came from outside. It was the condition of the landscape. She had never asked what the debt was actually for. She had never asked who had created it. She turned her head and looked at Adrian's profile in the dark of the car. The dashboard lights gave everything a blue-gray cast, and his face was very controlled, the way it always was, and he was watching the road with the focused attention of a man who was not going to be the one to speak first. That told her something. "How long have you known my father?" she said. His jaw moved, just slightly. "Elena, how long?" The highway moved under them. A truck passed going the other direction, its lights sweeping through the car and then gone. "Since before you were born," he said. The words landed somewhere in her chest and detonated slowly, the way certain things do, not all at once, but in expanding rings, each one reaching a new part of her and changing it. She sat very still and let the rings expand, and she counted her breaths, and she did not say anything for another 2 miles. "Tell me," she said. "This isn't the time. Adrian." Her voice came out harder than she'd intended, stripped of everything except the core of it. "You are driving me to an undisclosed location in the middle of the night with no way to reach anyone, and Kovacs just told me you know something about my father that I don't. Tell me, now." His hands shifted on the wheel, a small adjustment, both hands dropping to a lower position, the grip changing. She had learned to read him in 8 days in ways she hadn't managed in 3 years, and she understood that this gesture meant he was preparing to do something uncomfortable. "Your father came to my family when you were 11, he said. "He needed capital for a business expansion, the kind of capital he couldn't get through legitimate channels. My father arranged it." A pause. "On terms." "What terms?" "He was a poor businessman. The expansion failed within 2 years. The debt doubled under the interest structure my father had built in. By the time you were 16, your father owed us 3 times what he'd borrowed. By the time you were 23, he stopped. "By the time I was 23, she said, "he couldn't pay. He had nothing that could service the debt except—" He stopped again. She heard it before he said it. She heard it in the pause, in the specific shape of what wasn't being said, and the hearing of it was like something she'd been standing on giving way beneath her. "He offered me," she said. Adrian didn't answer. The non-answer was the answer. She looked out the windshield, the road, the dark, the ordinary landscape of a highway at night, completely indifferent to the fact that in this car, a woman had just discovered that the terms of her captivity had been negotiated when she was 23 years old and hadn't known it, that her father had laid her down like a payment on a ledger, that the man sitting next to her had accepted her. "Did you ask for me?" she said. "Specifically." The pause before he answered was the longest one yet. "No," he said, "but you accepted." "Yes." "Why?" He drove for a moment. She watched his face. "Because your father was going to find another way to pay," he said, "and the other way would have been worse." He said it quietly, without the cadence of justification, just the flat weight of fact. There were other men at the table that night, men who also held portions of the debt. What they would have accepted as payment wasn't something I was willing to let happen. She absorbed that. She held it up to the light and examined it from every angle, looking for the self-serving version of it, the rationalization, the place where what he was telling her was designed to make him the lesser of evils rather than an evil. She found the place. She also found, underneath it, something that didn't feel like a lie. You could have settled the debt, she said, just forgiven it, or structured a payment plan. You could have found ways. Yes, he said, I could have. But you didn't. Another pause, this one different from the others, not evasive, but containing something he was deciding whether to give her. I had seen you, he said. Once, at an event 18 months before. You were with your father. He kept his eyes on the road. You were arguing with him, quietly, so no one could hear, but I could see it from across the room, and you were... He stopped. What? She said. Her voice had gone strange. She could hear it. Losing, he said. You were losing the argument, and you knew it. And I could see that you knew it, and you weren't going to stop fighting anyway. He was quiet for a moment. I thought about that. When the situation with your father came to a head, I thought about that specific thing. The car moved through the dark. She didn't speak. It wasn't clean, he said. What I did. I'm not going to tell you it was. No, she said. It wasn't. She turned back to the window. She had walked into his office 9 days ago with divorce papers and the story she'd told herself about her own life, that she had been swallowed by circumstances beyond her control, that the debt was her father's failure, that the marriage was an external force that had happened to her. And all of that was true. It was also incomplete. The circumstances had been constructed. The debt had been engineered over years by a family that had known exactly what they were building toward and why. And Adrian Voss had been at the end of that chain, not as the architect of the original trap, but as the man who'd stepped in when the trap was closing and reframed the terms, and told himself, possibly believed, that this made him something other than the man who'd accepted her. She was not ready to decide what she thought about that. She was not going to decide in a moving car at 3 a.m. with Kovacs in the wind and a mountain property still an hour away. What she was going to do was set it exactly where it needed to be. Not ignored, not resolved, but held. Filed in the part of her mind that was still operational, still running the numbers, still doing the work that kept them both alive. Because whatever Adrian Voss had done or hadn't done 3 years ago, the threat in front of them was real and immediate, and she needed to be functional. She was going to be very angry about all of this later. She was going to be spectacular about it, actually, but not yet. When we get to the property, she said, voice steady, I need everything. Every file, every contact, every piece of intelligence you have on Moretti's operation. And I need to know who Kovacs would run to first, not Moretti. Who inside Moretti's network? Who's his actual relationship? Adrian looked at her, quick glance, back to the road. You're not, he started. I'm not what? Shutting down? Falling apart? She heard her own voice, flat and precise. I'm angry, Adrian. I'm angry in a way I'm going to need to deal with when there's time to deal with it. Right now there isn't. So tell me who Kovacs runs to. A beat. Then, man named Dario Fenn, Moretti's logistics chief. He and Kovacs have a history. They worked together 12 years ago before Kovacs came to me. Fenn is the one who would shelter him. Where does Fenn operate out of? He has a permanent residence in the city, 2 safe houses that we know of, one on the east side, one north of downtown. But if Kovacs is trying to disappear, he won't use either, she said. He's too smart. He'll use something Fenn has that isn't in any file, a personal property, family maybe. Something with a human relationship at the center of it, not an operational one. She thought about Kovacs at the Caldwell dinner, the watch touching, the late arrival, the smile that had known things. He thinks personally. He establishes genuine connections and then uses them, the same way he managed to stay inside your organization for 7 years without triggering suspicion. She paused. Does Fenn have family in this city? A sister, Adrian said after a moment. She runs a restaurant in the Meridian district. Fenn visits her once a month when he's in the city. That's where Kovacs is, she said. Adrian's phone was already in his hand. The mountain property appeared at the end of a private road that cut through dense forest, the headlights finding it in pieces. First a gate, then gravel, then the low sprawl of a building that was bigger than it looked from the outside, built into the hillside in a way that made it recede rather than impose. Dark stone. Very few windows visible from the approach, the kind of place designed to exist without being seen. A man was waiting outside. Mid-40s, built without excess, the kind of stillness that came from genuine calm rather than performed neutrality. Garrett, Elena assumed. Adrian had said his name like it meant something. House is clear, Garrett said. No other greeting. She needs the Moretti files, Adrian said. Everything we have on Fenn, and I need a line to Piers. The brother. Elena registered the name and filed it. Garrett looked at Elena, not with hostility, with the particular assessment of someone cataloging a new element. You're the wife, he said. I'm Elena, she said. He nodded as if that were a sufficient correction and led them inside. The next 6 hours were the most concentrated of her life. The files were extensive. Garrett pulled them on a secured system in a room that had clearly been designed as a working space. Long table, multiple screens, the kind of setup that didn't need to apologize for what it was. Elena sat down and she worked. She went through the Moretti intelligence with the same systematic attention she'd brought to her legal pad 8 days ago, but faster now, with more context, her understanding of the organizational structure connecting to what she'd observed at events in ways that built a picture she could see whole. Adrian worked beside her, not over her shoulder, beside her in the actual sense, sitting at the same table with his own materials, cross-referencing, occasionally asking a question that she answered without looking up. The working silence between them was nothing like any silence she'd experienced with him before. It had texture. It was collaborative. It was, she thought once and then put away, what it might have felt like to actually be married to someone. At 4:43 in the morning, her phone rang again. Unknown. She looked at Adrian. He nodded. She answered. It wasn't Kovacs this time. It was a woman's voice. Measured, slightly accented, familiar in a way that took Elena 3 full seconds to place because she'd only heard it in formal settings and never expected to hear it at 4 in the morning from an unknown number, Reina. I need to speak with Adrian, she said. Elena looked at Adrian. She said, It's Reina. The change in his face was immediate and total. A compression, every muscle pulling tight, something igniting behind his eyes that was the closest she had ever seen him come to rage. Put it on speaker, he said. His voice had dropped an entire register. Elena did. Reina, he said. A pause. I know what you think, Reina said. I think you've been feeding my organization's intelligence to Victor Moretti for 2 years. I think you gave him the terms of my marriage contract. I think you helped him build a template to trap other women in the same situation. And I think you ran tonight because you knew I was coming. His voice was completely controlled. That was the most frightening thing about it. Tell me something different. A longer pause. I didn't run from you, Reina said. I ran from Moretti. He decided I was a liability 3 days ago. He sent people to my apartment. I've been ahead of them since Tuesday. A pause. I know what I did, Adrian. I'm not going to spend time on that. What I'm going to tell you is that Moretti is moving tonight. He knows you're at the mountain property. He has people 40 minutes out. Elena was on her feet before Reina finished the sentence. How many? Adrian said. 6, maybe 8. He's not trying to negotiate. He decided that eliminating you directly is cleaner than continuing to work around you. A pause. Kovacs is with them. He volunteered. He's the one who told Moretti about the property. Adrian ended the call. He looked at Garrett. Wake everyone, he said. Full defensive positions. I want the east approach covered first, the road second. Nobody moves a vehicle. They'll have the road monitored. Garrett was already moving. Elena was already thinking. The files, she said. We can't leave them here. Garrett will handle it. Not the digital files, the paper trail. The specific documents that show the full structure of Moretti's operation. If he takes this property and finds those, he knows exactly what we have on him and closes every hole. She looked around the room. I need 15 minutes with these before we move. We don't have 15 minutes. Then give me 10. He looked at her for a second, a real second, the kind where something was being decided, And then he said, 7, and left the room. She worked in 7 minutes the way she had never worked before in her life, pulling the documents that mattered most, making decisions in seconds that would have taken her an hour of deliberation under normal conditions. She wasn't extracting everything. She was extracting the architecture, the specific financial connections, the accounts, the names at the nodes of Moretti's network that couldn't be reconstructed if lost. She rolled them, rubber banded them, put them inside her bag against her body. She was at the door when the first shot hit the window. Not inside, it didn't breach the glass, which was clearly reinforced, but the sound of it was a concussive crack that moved through her body from her sternum outward, and she stopped moving for exactly 1 second, which was all the freeze response got before something else took over. She dropped low. She moved along the wall to the door. She opened it. The hallway was Adrian. He was there, physically there, 3 feet from the door. And when she came through low, he grabbed her arm, and they moved together down the corridor without speaking, the way people move when the words have been replaced by something more immediate. There are 4 of them on the east side, he said, low and fast. Garrett has 2 men on the perimeter. Piers is on the phone. He can have support here in 40 minutes. We don't have 40 minutes. No, he said. We don't. They reached a room near the back of the property, a secondary office, small, 1 window that looked out over the hillside, dropping away behind the building. In the dark, Elena could see the tree line. She could hear, from the front of the house, the sound of voices she didn't recognize, and the specific controlled chaos of Garrett's people responding, and she understood with the clarity that comes only from genuine crisis that the property was being taken. Not immediately, not in the next 5 minutes, but in the next 40. Moretti had sent enough people, placed them well enough, and they had the advantage of knowing the terrain because Reyna had told them, Reyna or Kovac, and whoever was holding this property at dawn was going to be in control of what happened next. Adrian pulled a locked case from under the desk and opened it, and Elena didn't let herself think about what was in it because she didn't have time to think about what was in it. There's a vehicle in the maintenance shed, he said, below the east tree line. Garrett's people know not to touch it. It's not registered to anything connected to me. He handed her a key. If this position becomes untenable— Don't finish that sentence, she said. He looked at her. Don't tell me to run, she said. I'm not running. Tell me what you need me to do. Something crossed his face. It was there and gone in under a second, and she couldn't name it, but it was real and it was significant, and she would have time to think about what it meant later, when there was later. I need you to call Reyna back, he said. She blinked. What? She's the only person who knows exactly which entry points Moretti's team is using and how they're staged. She called us, which means she made a choice. I need to know if that choice is real. He held her gaze. She'll talk to you. She won't talk to me right now, not yet. Elena stared at him. The sounds from the front of the house had changed, more concentrated, closer. The tree line outside the window was dark and still. In a way that dark and still, things weren't supposed to be at 5 in the morning when the wind should have been moving through them. You're trusting me to read her, she said. Yes. She pulled out her phone. She found the unknown number. She called. Reyna answered in 1 ring. He wants information on the entry points, Elena said. No preamble. Tell me, and I'll give you whatever exit you need from this. Not from Adrian. From me. My word. A sharp sound on the other end that might have been a bitter sound. Your word, Reyna said. You've been his wife for 3 years. And he's kept me at arm's length for 3 years, Elena said, which you know better than anyone because you're the one who drafted the agreement that made sure of it. So you know my word is separate from his. Tell me. A silence. 3 seconds. 4. West side, Reyna said. There's a secondary approach they haven't covered through the maintenance shed corridor. Kovac knows about it. He's not with the main team. He separated 20 minutes ago. He's coming in through the west side alone because he doesn't trust Moretti's people to do what needs to be done. A pause. He's coming in through the west side because his actual target isn't Adrian. Elena went completely still. His target is you, Reyna said. The files you took. He knows you pulled the core documents. If you disappear with those, Moretti can't plug the holes in his network. Kovac promised him he'd recover them. The maintenance shed. Elena had been handed the key to the maintenance shed 10 minutes ago. She lowered the phone and turned and looked at Adrian and saw on his face that he had heard every word, and she watched his expression do something she had never seen it do before. Every layer of control dropping at once, not because he'd chosen to let it, but because what had just been said had knocked it loose, and what was underneath was not the composed, dangerous man she'd been navigating for 3 years. What was underneath was a man who was afraid, not for himself. "Don't," he said. "He's already there," she said. "If we run, he's waiting. If we stay, Moretti's main team reaches the building and—" "I know. Then we have one option." She held his gaze. "Someone goes through the west side first." "Yes," he said, "and walks into whatever Kovacs has set up." "Yes." His voice was rough in a way she'd never heard. "Me. I go. You stay here and you—" "No," she said. "Elena, no." She said it the same way he'd said no to her divorce papers 2 weeks ago, like a wall, like something that didn't need more words than that. "He's not expecting 2 of us. He's staged for a single approach. If you go alone, he has every advantage. If we go together and something goes wrong, then something goes wrong for both of us," she said, "which is the same thing that happens if we stay here in 40 minutes when Moretti's team reaches the building." He looked at her. His face was doing something extraordinary. The fear was still there, not hidden now, not managed, just visible in the set of his jaw and the way his eyes had gone very direct and very dark. And underneath it was something she had been aware of for days without letting herself look at it fully, something that had been building in the working silences and the shared glances and the dance at the Caldwell dinner and the car ride and the 7 minutes she'd spent extracting documents while he'd given her exactly the time she'd asked for without question. She looked at it now. She didn't have time to look away. "I'm not losing you," he said. It came out of him like something he hadn't decided to say. 3 words, rough at the edges, with nothing polished about them, and they landed in the room and stayed there. She breathed. "You're not going to," she said. She moved to the door. She heard him behind her. The hallway was dark, and the sounds of the house were the sounds of a controlled crisis, and the west corridor was 30 feet ahead, and somewhere on the other side of the maintenance shed was a man who had decided she was the obstacle between him and the thing he needed. And she had the key in her hand and her bag against her body, and Adrian Voss 1 step behind her, and the only thing between where they were standing and everything that came after was the next 30 seconds. She did not let herself think about what came after. She moved. The maintenance shed smelled like motor oil and cold earth and the particular staleness of a space that had been sealed for weeks. Elena went through the door low and fast, the way Adrian had shown her without showing her, by moving that way himself in the hallway, and her body had understood and copied it, the specific economy of someone who didn't want to present a silhouette. The key had been in her hand, and now the door was behind her and the shed was dark, except for what came through 2 small windows set high in the wall, and she stopped moving and stood absolutely still and listened. Adrian was 1 step behind her. She could feel him without touching him, the heat of him, the particular way his presence registered in a space, something she had learned over 3 years without meaning to. The shed was maybe 40 feet long, farm equipment she couldn't name in the dark. A vehicle under a tarp at the far end. That would be the one he'd told her about. Between where they stood and the far wall, darkness, shapes, the smell of oil, and somewhere in it, Kovacs. She heard him before she saw him. Not footsteps. Breath. The specific quality of controlled breathing from a man who was trying not to be heard and was very good at it but had been waiting long enough that his body was overriding his discipline by small increments. Somewhere to the left. Maybe 20 feet. Adrian put his hand on her arm. Gentle. Specific pressure. Don't move. She didn't move. She heard Adrian's voice come from directly beside her, low and unhurried. The voice of a man who had decided that the darkness was not an advantage worth protecting. "Kovacs," he said. The breath stopped. "It's just us," Adrian said. "However you've staged this, I want you to think about whether it gets you what you actually want. Not what Moretti wants. What you want." Silence. Long enough that Elena's eyes had adjusted by fractions, and she could see the shapes better now. A workbench to the left, a stack of something against the wall, and there, In the angle between the bench and the wall, a darker shape among the dark shapes that had a different quality from the machinery, the quality of a person holding still. "What I want," Kovac said from the dark. His voice was flat and cold and very tired. "What I want is to not be the man who gets buried by Victor Moretti because he's no longer useful, which is what happens if I go back empty-handed." A pause. "The documents, Elena. Put them on the workbench and walk out. That's the whole conversation." "And Adrian?" she said. "Adrian and I have a different conversation." "No," Adrian said. "We don't. Whatever you think that conversation looks like, it doesn't. Because we've known each other for 7 years, Kovac, and I know exactly how you sound when you're out of options. And you sound like that right now." A long pause. "You have no idea," Kovac said, "what it costs to be inside your organization for 7 years. You have no idea what Moretti threatened, what he has on me, the things I would lose." He stopped. Something in his voice had cracked slightly and then been repaired. "This wasn't about money." "I know," Adrian said. The two words landed in the shed with unexpected weight. Elena heard them and felt the shift they caused. Not a softening, but a change in pressure, the way certain admissions change the temperature of a room. "Then you know I didn't have a choice," Kovac said. "We always have a choice," Adrian said. "It's just that some of them are unbearable. That doesn't mean they don't exist." He paused. "Come out. We finish this in the light. You tell me everything. Moretti's full network, the contacts, the accounts, all of it. And I give you something Moretti can't give you, a way out that doesn't end in a ditch." The darkness breathed. Elena stood very still. She was aware of her own heartbeat in a way that was almost intellectual. She could feel it in her fingertips, in the base of her throat, in the particular aliveness of a body that understood its situation at a level below language. She was also aware of the bag against her side, the documents inside it, and the specific calculation happening in the shed right now between two men who had known each other for 7 years and had run out of the version of that relationship that had made sense before tonight. The shape in the corner moved. Kovac stepped out of the angle between the workbench and the wall and into the slightly less dark center of the shed, and Elena saw him properly for the first time tonight. He looked older than the Caldwell dinner. He looked older than 7 years of knowing him should have made him. The particular aging of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has started to show it in the structure of his face. He was holding a gun. He held it at his side. Not raised, not pointed, but held. The posture of a man who hadn't decided yet. Adrian stepped forward. Just one step. Into whatever light the high windows offered, enough that his face was visible. And Elena saw that he too had a weapon. At his hip, hand near it, but not on it. The tableau of two men who were each acknowledging what the other was holding and choosing, for this moment, to not be the one who raised the stakes. "Tell me about Moretti," Adrian said. "Start from the beginning." It took 40 minutes. Elena stood against the wall of the shed, and she listened and she memorized, because that was what she did, and Kovac talked. He talked with the particular exhaustion of a man who has been maintaining a lie for so long that the relief of stopping is physical. She could actually see it in his posture, the gradual unburdening, his shoulders dropping incrementally as the sentences came out. He told them about the first contact from Moretti's network 4 years ago, not 6 months as they'd believed. He told them about his sister, who lived in a city 3 states away, and had debts of her own. Not to the Voss family, but to people connected to Moretti, debts that had been manufactured specifically to create leverage. He told them about Stellan, who had been recruited separately and had never known Kovac was also feeding information, 2 parallel channels that Moretti had kept deliberately isolated. He told them about Reina, who had come to the arrangement differently, not through coercion, but through a business relationship with Moretti that had preceded her work for Adrian by years, an original loyalty that had simply never changed. He told them about the marriage contract, the specific request from Moretti's network to obtain the terms, the way Reina had provided them not as a betrayal in the moment, but as part of a long-standing arrangement to share organizational intelligence. Elena listened to all of it, and she held a specific rage very quietly in the center of her body, and she did not let it into her face or her posture or her breathing. When Kovacs finished, the shed was very quiet. "Your sister," Adrian said. "The debts." "Yes." "Give Garrett the details, tonight. I'll have it handled by morning." He said it without grandeur, without making it a gift. Just a fact being stated, a thing that was going to happen. Kovacs looked at him. The gun was still in his hand, still at his side. "Why?" he said. "Because she didn't make the choice you made," Adrian said. "She just ended up in it. That's a different thing." Something happened in Kovacs' face. Elena watched it. The particular movement of a man who had braced himself for one version of reality and was being required to process a different one. His grip on the gun loosened slightly, not all the way, but slightly. "And me," he said. "You're going to have a conversation with people I trust," Adrian said. "Tonight. Everything you just told me, again, on record. Then we see." He looked at Kovacs directly. "I'm not going to tell you it's fine. It's not fine. 7 years, Kovacs. I'm going to be angry about that for a long time. But I'm also not Moretti. I don't handle things by ending them. So, we see." The gun went down. Fully. Kovacs set it on the workbench and stepped back from it and rubbed his face with both hands, the gesture of a man surfacing from something. "Call Garrett," Elena said to Adrian. Quietly. Practical. He did. The next 2 hours were organized chaos that felt strangely like the beginning of order. Garrett arrived with 2 people Elena hadn't met. Kovacs went with them to a different part of the property, and she heard the low, sustained sound of a debriefing beginning, methodical and thorough. Adrian's brother Piers arrived just before sunrise, younger than Adrian by several years, similar structure but different energy, something warmer in his face that suggested the same material had been shaped by different circumstances. He looked at Elena when they were introduced and said, "You're the one who identified Stellan," and she said yes, and he nodded as if she'd confirmed something he'd already concluded. The main threat resolved itself with the particular anticlimax of things that have been built toward for days. Moretti's team, arriving to find the property defended and their intelligence advantage neutralized, made the tactical calculation that the operation was compromised and withdrew. It wasn't a victory in the cinematic sense. There was no confrontation, no decisive moment, no clear before and after. They simply stopped coming, which was its own kind of statement about the calculus Moretti was now running, and about what Kovacs' defection meant for the information the other side had believed was secure. Victor Moretti became, in the days that followed, a problem with a different shape. Not an immediate physical threat, but a long political one. An ongoing negotiation that would take months to resolve and would require the kind of careful maneuvering that Elena had, over the course of 2 weeks, demonstrated she was unusually good at. But that was later. The morning after the shed, Elena sat on the steps at the back of the mountain property and watched the sun come up over the tree line, and she was so tired that the tiredness had passed through exhaustion and arrived somewhere quieter. A kind of stripped-down clarity that she'd never experienced before, where the noise of everything she'd been managing had temporarily gone still. She heard the door behind her, and Adrian came out and sat down beside her on the steps. Not close. The distance of 2 people who were being honest about where they were. They sat for a while without talking. "My father," she said eventually. Not a question, not an accusation, just the subject, placed between them. "Yes," he said. "He knew what he was doing when he came to your family the first time. He knew the interest structure. He understood what the terms would build toward." "Yes," he said again. "He let it happen. For years. He let the debt grow, and he let me believe it was circumstance, bad luck, business failure," she breathed. "He let me believe I was sacrificing myself for someone who hadn't seen it coming." The sun was moving through the trees, changing the light by increments, the way light changed at this hour. Not dramatically, just steadily, the world slowly becoming more visible. "I know," Adrian said. "You could have told me. At any point in 3 years. You could have told me what you actually knew about how it was structured." "Yes." "Why didn't you?" He was quiet for a moment. The real kind of quiet. the kind that meant he was locating something true rather than something defensible. Because knowing it wouldn't have changed your situation, he said. You were still in the marriage. Knowing that your father had been more culpable than you understood would have added pain without exit. He paused. And because I wasn't ready for you to know how much of it I'd seen and accepted anyway. She turned and looked at him. He was looking at the tree line, his forearms on his knees, the particular posture of someone who was not trying to manage how they appeared. I'm angry about this, she said. I want to be clear about that. I'm going to be angry about it for a long time. I know. The way it was structured, the agreement, what Raina built into it. She stopped. Then, I've spent 3 years blaming circumstance for something that was constructed. I need time with that. You can have time with it, he said. I'm not asking your permission. I know, he said. I'm saying, I understand. I'm not going to push for anything. Whatever you need from this, whatever you decide about, all of it. I'm not going to push. She looked at him for a long moment. The man who had sat across from her at 1,000 dinners and looked past her, who had shredded her divorce papers without blinking and then, within 2 weeks, sat beside her at a workbench and treated her intelligence as the most valuable thing in the room, who had said, I'm not losing you in a dark hallway with the rough, honest delivery of someone who hadn't prepared the words. She didn't have a neat way to hold all of that. She suspected she wouldn't for some time. What happens to Moretti now? She said. Negotiation. He's rational. That's always been the problem with him, and also the solution to him. When the cost-benefit calculation changes, he adjusts. Right now he's lost Kovacs, Raina, his intelligence advantage, and the operational initiative. The mathematics of direct conflict with my organization stopped making sense for him sometime around 4 this morning. Adrian paused. Piers will handle the opening channels. He's better at the diplomatic side than I am. And Raina? A longer pause. She made a choice tonight, he said. She could have stayed with Moretti. Instead, she called and gave us the information about Kovacs and the West approach. He looked at his hands. That doesn't undo 2 years. It doesn't undo the contract or what she enabled with the marriage template. But it exists, and it has to be part of whatever comes next. He looked at Elena. I'd like you in those conversations. When the time comes. You read people in ways I've apparently been missing. She almost said something sharp about the lateness of that recognition. She let it go. We'll see, she said. They sat with the morning for a while. The property around them was beginning to stir. She could hear voices from inside, the ordinary sounds of people moving through a space that had been a siege position 6 hours ago and was now becoming something more livable. There are no divorce papers, she said. You shredded them. I did, he said. I'll need new ones drawn up, by a lawyer I choose. He nodded. I'll have everything you need transferred to you. The accounts, the documentation, whatever exit looks like for you, practically, I'll make it as clean as possible. He said it without inflection, the way you state a plan you've already accepted. She studied his profile. You're not going to argue. No. 2 weeks ago you put documents through a shredder while looking me in the eye. 2 weeks ago I was a different kind of stupid, he said, flat and without excuse. I thought holding on to something was the same as keeping it. I've had some evidence recently that I was wrong about that. She looked away, back at the tree line. The sun was fully up now, the forest bright and specific, each tree individual in the light. I'm not making any decisions today, she said, about any of it. Okay. I need to find my own lawyer, file the paperwork properly, figure out what my actual life looks like outside of the context of this. She gestured vaguely at the property, at the compound, at everything it represented. I need to know what I want when I'm not in crisis mode. I've been in crisis mode for 2 weeks and I don't trust decisions made in crisis mode. That's sensible, he said. I know it's sensible. I didn't ask for your assessment. The corner of his mouth moved, just slightly. She caught it and looked away before she could react to it. Can I ask you something? He said. You can ask. The night you overheard Damien in the hallway, you could have used that information differently. You could have taken it somewhere else entirely, sold it, or used it as leverage with someone outside the organization, or gone to the authorities with it and used the resulting chaos to force the divorce through in the confusion. He looked at her. Why didn't you? She thought about it. The honest version, not the strategic one. Because the people who would have gotten hurt by those options weren't only you, she said, and because she stopped, then made herself continue. Because even after 3 years of being invisible to you, I knew the difference between you and what you'd let yourself become inside your own organization. I knew it wasn't the same thing. She paused. I'm not saying that absolves anything. I'm saying I made a calculation that still made sense when I examined it from all angles. I went with the version of this that had the cleanest outcome for the most people. That's all. That's not all, he said. But, okay. She didn't argue with that. In the weeks that followed, Elena moved into a sublet on the east side of the city. A small place, 2 rooms and a kitchen with a window that looked out over a street she liked, with a bakery below that made the morning smell like something uncomplicated. She hired a lawyer she found herself, a different woman from the first one, and she sat in a clean, bright office and explained her situation with the directness of someone who had negotiated in rooms considerably more dangerous than this, and felt the specific satisfaction of being heard without the mediation of someone else's agenda. Adrian signed everything she put in front of him. He signed it within 24 hours each time, returned through her lawyer, no counteroffers, no delays, no renegotiation. She had expected at least one. She didn't get one. She went back to work. She had a degree she'd never fully used and a skill set that had been developed in circumstances her former professors could not have imagined, and she found, without too much difficulty, a position at a financial consulting firm that valued exactly the kind of pattern, recognition, and human intelligence she'd spent 3 years refining in rooms full of dangerous people. She was good at the work, in a way that felt like coming back to a language she'd spoken before the interruption. She didn't see Adrian for 6 weeks. He called once, 2 weeks in. She let it go to voicemail. His message was brief and contained nothing she needed to respond to. He was letting her know that the Moretti situation had been formally resolved through back-channel negotiation, that Kovach's sister's debts had been cleared, that Reina had agreed to a structured process that would take considerable time but had begun. He said he hoped she was well. He said nothing else. She listened to it twice and then deleted it, and she thought about calling back, and she decided not to, and the decision felt like the right one, and also like something that had a cost she wasn't done paying. She called her father. That conversation took 40 minutes and covered things that had needed covering for years. Her father sounded like himself, the particular mixture of contrition and defensiveness that she had known her whole life, the pattern she had mistaken for character when it was actually the habit of a man who had always found a way to make his failures something that happened to other people. She let him speak. She didn't shout. She said the things she needed to say in the clear, even voice of someone who had rehearsed nothing because she didn't need to, because the truth didn't require preparation. At the end of the conversation, she told him she loved him because that was also true. And she told him that the terms of their relationship were going to change. And she told him that she was no longer available to be the solution to problems he created. He said he understood. She didn't know if he did. She thought maybe it didn't matter as much as it used to. The 6th week, she ran into Adrian at a coffee place 2 blocks from her apartment, which was statistically unlikely, she thought, and then revised that thought almost immediately. The city was not as large as it liked to pretend, and they had navigated the same circles for 3 years. He was at the counter when she came in. He saw her before she saw him, and she registered that in his expression when she noticed him, the fraction of a second before he arranged it into something neutral, the unguarded thing that was there and then wasn't. She ordered her coffee. He stepped aside to wait for his. They stood in the unremarkable space of a coffee counter at 9 in the morning, and the ordinary noise of the place moved around them. "How's the job?" he said. She looked at him. "Good," she said. "Better than good. How's the organization?" "Rebuilding," he said. "Slowly. It's better done slowly." She nodded. Their coffees came. She picked hers up and she looked at him one more time. The full look, not the careful social one. The one that took in all of it, the whole complicated history. The things he'd done and failed to do and done badly and done differently when given a different version of himself to work from. "You look like you're sleeping," she said. "Better than before," he said. "You?" "Better than before," she said. She moved toward the door. She stopped. She stood with her hand not quite on the door, and she thought about walking through it. She thought about the morning on the steps at the mountain property, and the shed, and the hallway, and the dance at the Caldwell dinner, and all the silences she'd learned to read. She thought about the question she actually needed to answer, the one that wasn't about logistics or legality or the structured negotiation of an exit from a life she hadn't chosen. The one that was just hers, just personal, just the truth of what she wanted when everything that wasn't her had been cleared away. She turned around. "Have you eaten?" she said. He looked at her, carefully, like a man who had learned something about the cost of misreading a moment and was not going to risk it. "No," he said. "There's a place around the corner," she said. "Not a Voss Tower kind of place, just a place. I go there sometimes." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not deciding anything. I'm not making any promises. I'm also not pretending that 6 weeks of distance has resolved 3 years of complicated, because it hasn't." She held his gaze. "But I'm asking if you want to eat breakfast." He was quiet for a moment, just long enough to be real. "Yes," he said. They walked out into the morning. The street was ordinary. People going to work, the smell from the bakery below her apartment, the city doing what it always did without consulting anyone about it. She walked at her own pace, and he walked beside her, and neither of them reached for anything yet. And the space between them was not the cold, empty space of 3 years of avoidance, but something different, something that had been cleared for different purposes, something that was still being decided. The restaurant was small, 6 tables. A woman at the counter who recognized Elena and nodded. They sat across from each other, and the table between them was just a table. Not the polished expanse of a formal dinner, not the charged distance of an office negotiation, just a surface with a coffee cup on each side and the morning light coming through a window. She looked at her menu. He looked at his. "I'm still angry," she said, without looking up. "I know," he said. "I'm going to be angry about some of it for a long time. I know that too. And I make my own decisions now. About everything. No agreements, no terms, no structures." "Yes," he said. She looked up. He was looking at her the way he'd looked at her in the car on the mountain road, direct and unmanaged, with everything that had been learned over the last 3 years visible in it. "Then we'll see," she said. She went back to her menu. Outside the window, the city continued its morning, ordinary and continuous. And 1 year later, Adrian would walk into a small restaurant 2 blocks from a sublet on the east side and sit across from a woman who had rebuilt her life from the inside out and place a ring box on the table between them and say nothing at all, because he'd understood by then that she didn't need words. She needed proof. And the proof was not the ring, but the year of it. The year of showing up differently, of earning something he'd once tried to simply claim, of learning the particular discipline of a man who loved someone enough to let her decide. She would open the box. She would look at it for a long time. Then she would look at him, and he would look at her, and between them would be everything that had happened and also everything that had been chosen after, and the choosing after was the thing that mattered, the thing neither of them could have managed 3 years ago because neither of them had been yet who they needed to be. She would pick up the ring, she would put it on herself, and she would say, "Don't make me regret this." And he would say, "I won't." And that would be, in the end, enough. Not because it erased anything, not because the past became simple or clean or easy to hold, but because they were both people who had walked through a version of the worst of themselves and chosen to be accountable for it, and that the choosing, the accountability, the daily decision to be something better than what fear and control and loneliness had made them, was the thing that held. Not a perfect thing, a real one, which, in the end, was the only kind worth keeping.